begin today, I want to take the opportunity to once again thank Father Anthony for inviting me to preach several times this spring and summer. Today's sermon is the fourth and final segment of the Martin sermon hostage situation. And following today's service, each of you here today has been granted your unconditional release and freedom. In all seriousness, this cradle Episcopalian finds opportunities like this fulfilling and a true privilege, so thank you. That being said, let us begin. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. Henry Ford once said, you can't build a reputation on what you're going to do. You just have to do it. John the Baptist might have been accused of a lot of things, but not of putting off direct action. Two of my fraternity brothers from college have pursued careers in law enforcement and have had careers of honor and integrity. One of them actually attended the police academy while still pursuing his undergraduate college degree. As a young police recruit, being tested was part of the process to determine if he was up to the job. Many of the written test questions were basically a series of situations to see if he had the sort of character and intuition required for the job. For a moment, let me share one of these situations he once told me about. There's a tremendous crash, a car wreck on a city street, and a crowd is gathered. You push through the crowd to see two seriously injured occupants. You smell the fumes of alcohol. You glimpse their faces and recognize one as the wife of the senior officer in charge of your police unit. Then you remember that her husband is away on a business trip. What should you do? What was his answer? Well, he answered the question correctly, don't get me wrong, but he jokingly replied to me in telling this story, I would have actually changed my clothes and tried to blend in with the crowd. This was very different from what John the Baptist actually chose to do in a similar situation of his era, with more than one parallel with my fraternity brother's police testing question. I suspect even today John's actions would have been unusual and even a great embarrassment to his followers in terms of what we might consider a leader of the establishment to represent. Leaders are meant to be respectable. In John's day, the leaders of church and society were dressed like leaders in nice clothes. These days, for the most part, leaders of the church are similarly, typically, and respectably dressed, and for formal occasions, very respectfully dressed. In John's day, leaders of the church and society lived in nice houses, but John seemed to spurn such basic comfort and niceties. Would it be any different today? I don't think John, dressed in the skins of wild animals and living off what he could scrounge in the desert, food like wild honey and locusts, would blend in any better today than he did in the reign of King Herod. William Hendrickson, a late theological commentator and an ordained minister in the Reformed Church, suggests a picture of what the wilderness was at the time of John the Baptist. This was the wilderness of Judea, an up and down wasteland country with the center of Judea to the west, and in the east, the Dead Sea, and the lower, the Jordan, stretching northward. According to Hendrickson, this was indeed a desolation, a vast, undulating expanse of barren, chalky soil, covered with pebbles, broken stones, and rocks. Here and there, a bit of brushwood appeared, but with snakes growing underneath. Another commentator described it as, it shimmers in the haze of the heat. The limestone rock is hot and blistering, and sounds hollow to the feet, as if there was some vast furnace underneath. In the Old Testament, the region was sometimes called Jeshimon, which means the devastation. Hendrickson finds parallel between John's chosen setting, and his message goes on. Quote, it is even evident from Isaiah and John's preaching, as recorded by Mark, that the wilderness through which a path must be made ready for the Lord is, in the final analysis, that the people's hearts that were inclined to all evil. A man who can survive in such a place is no wimp. He was obviously compromising with his lifestyle, but he was purely uncompromising with his words. In John's day, church leaders, as is typically the case today, were not outspoken, but rather were cautious and diplomatic. certainly not challenging the top leaders and politicians as directly as John the Baptist. John had previously told Herod Antipas, the Herod we hear about today, that he was illegally married to a close relative. To tell this man that to his face was not exactly diplomatic, and given royalty's autocratic rights in those times, far more dangerous than it would be today. Which brings us to the drama played out in today's reading. First, some background. The setting of the events in today's gospel, the castle of Machaerus, is not the stuff of picture postcards. It was bleak and desolate, overlooking the east side of the Dead Sea. Like a number of such castles of the time, it had most unpleasant dungeons, where the ruler's enemies or innocent victims might await their fate. Even today, tourists can see the huge staples and iron hooks in the walls to which a prisoner, such as John the Baptist, would likely have been bound. The Herods weren't exactly a pleasant family either. Herod Antipas had a particularly malicious father, one who had murdered at least 3 of his other sons, and a number of other members of his family, including having one of his wives executed for high treason. The Jewish saying at the time was that it was safer to be Herod's pig than Herod's son. One of the sons, Herod Philip, missed out on inheriting any of his father's land, but went instead to live as a wealthy man in Rome. While he was there, Herod Antipas turned up to visit him, and as one does when one is of that family, he seduced Herod Philip's wife Herodias, and, to make matters worse, married her despite the Jewish law saying it was forbidden. When John turned up saying the marriage was illegal, Herodias was outraged. Although Herod Antipas was furious, perhaps because he respected John the Baptist for his brave honesty, he locked him up instead of killing him. Herodias was not satisfied with this level of punishment and cooked up the dancing girl plot with her daughter. As far as Jewish morality was concerned, even this was an outrage. Dancing girls were almost always prostitutes, and their dancing was seen to be highly immoral. The fact that the daughter of Herodias should turn up to Herod's birthday to expose herself in such a demeaning way would have seemed almost beyond belief to most local people of the time. Perhaps in view of his previous track record, it was not surprising that Herod Antipas was impressed and taken by her performance, and when he basically said in front of his guests she could name her own reward. He would have lost face if he had turned down her request for the head of John the Baptist. On one hand, this is a story of deeply flawed characters. Perhaps it was true that Herod was secretly admiring John the Baptist, but his family background and his lust caught him up to the extent he was unable to break free from his immoral relationships. Herodias must also have realized that John was simply speaking the truth, yet in effect organized his murder in a ruthless and calculated way, rather than allow John to continue to speak out and cause her and her husband further embarrassment. The daughter must similarly have realized that her actions, both in performing the seductive dance of a prostitute for her stepfather and in demanding John's execution, were highly immoral and cynical acts. There is also a curious postscript to this story. Herod Antipas eventually decided his position as the Tetrarch of Galilee was not quite the level of power he wanted, and a few years later went to Rome and asked the emperor to grant him the title of king. The emperor fortunately was not impressed. Instead of granting his request, the emperor decided he was being insolent and had him banished. Although the emperor offered to spare Herodias the same banishment, perhaps it is to her credit that Herodias decided to stick by her husband and went with him. For John the Baptist, both the unwelcome imprisonment in appalling conditions, followed by an unwarranted execution, was clearly an unpleasant end to a brave life. Yet as with Jesus, his steadfast holding to the truth, regardless of the consequences, continues to inspire through the centuries. John the Baptist, realizing the senior official, the Tetrarch of Galilee, was engaged in totally unacceptable behavior, most certainly did not change his clothes and blend in with the crowd. He spoke a truth that he believed needed to be spoken. Today the faces have changed, but the need for truth has not gone away. As we engage in our own tentative steps towards the truth, it is maybe that sooner or later we have to make our own choices whether or not to act. Have you ever encountered immorality which is a direct contradiction of what you believe your faith encourages you to stand for? When such moments come, we might do well to remember that observation of Henry Ford. You can't build a reputation on what you're going to do. Coming back now full circle, we see that this story too was likely sandwiched into Mark's gospel here with the purpose of reminding us that all John's story is actually a foreshadowing of Jesus' story. Jesus, like John, would be totally innocent of the worldly charges made against him. Jesus, like John, would be executed by the worldly powers that be, more out of political preservation and expedience than anything else. Yet, according to Mark, such stories are true for you and for me because they give us hope that God is still at work in people's lives. In such stories, we are full of hope that the prophetic word changes people's lives for the better, in spite of evil and tragedy. For God, in the face of evil, tragedy, and suffering, is able to work goodness, life, and salvation into this world and the next. That's certainly what the cross